So for today's challenge, the instruction says to select city key, city, state, province, and sales territory where the city contains capital A, small d, that small letter D, and capital C. And this is telling us that it is case sensitive. For this challenge, we'll be using the wide world importance database and the city dimension table. So let's head over to Power BI. So the first step, as usual, is to connect to your data source. Of course, if you like, you can start this directly in Visual Studio. So let's see, connect to the data source and select the city table, then click on OK to import the data into Power Query. So now we've imported the data. So this step, why I like importing the data here for the first time is that I can't remember most of the first step. When it comes to importing the data, okay, do I need to do SQL database? I don't want to start typing in these values, but you can do this if you want to get better at it. So I've already installed Visual Studio, so I can just start Visual Studio and copy this code. Click on done. So we'll still be bringing some of our code here, and I'll show you why we'll be doing that. So Visual Studio is up and running. So if you've not installed Visual Studio, you need to download Visual Studio. Remember, you want to download the Community Edition 2019. If you download the Community Edition 2020, you will not be able to use it. It does not support Power Query files, right? You can't do M programming in Visual Studio Community 2020. So the first step here is to click on Create New Project. After clicking on Create New Project, I can look at the recent ones. I use the PQ file, it's still here. So you click on Create Power Query file, then click on Connect. Then you can give this a name, let's say PQ Challenge 18. Let's just say PQ 18. I'm going to maintain the same name and click on Create. This is going to create a project for me. You get that? So it's going to create everything I need to work with the project I'm working on right now. So before I continue, I know you will have some questions on, okay, do I need to install any extension and stuff? Yes. After you're done installing Visual Studio, there are two things you need to install. So let me show you. The first thing you need to install is the Power Query extension. Power Query. It's an extension for Power Query. You need to just go to the search box and install that extension. I've already installed it. Then you may likely run into issues when you want to test this out. So for you to avoid that, make sure just go to the installer. Let me see, Visual Studio installer. Click on the installer. After clicking on the installer, you would want to modify the Visual Studio that you have already installed. So click on modify. After clicking on modify, you go to individual components. So after clicking on individual component, you should search for SDK Visual Studio. For people who have had Visual Studio on their system for a while and using it, they may not run into this issue. But if you are installing Visual Studio for the very first time, you may encounter this problem. So after searching for SDK Visual Studio, make sure you scroll down to the last row and confirm that Visual Studio SDK is installed. So if it's not installed, just click on it and install it. If you install it, you can close and come back into Power Query. That's when you can create your file easily and successfully, and you can continue with your analysis or whatever project you're working on. So we've already copied the query that we have in Power Query, we can just paste that query here, just some simple lines of code that we can paste here. Let me just add some extra lines to make this look better. For this, I get to expand this, and let's see. Yeah, let me just expand this, and finally keep this way. Yeah. So I don't know if I need to set anything up, but the should I call it indentation? The experience is a bit different here than it was in Visual Studio yesterday. And Visual Studio Code, you also see that some things are not working. Should I say are not working, or they didn't work the way they were working in Visual Studio Code? So let's start. What's the first step? The first step is to select the columns we want to work with. Personally, I'm lazy. I don't like typing, so I'll just copy the names of the columns from where we have it. So I'll just go over to Power Query. Well, not Power Query. I'll go to the file. Yep, we have the names of the columns here. So I'll just copy everything, then come back to Visual Studio and paste the names of the columns. And I'll take out the and. This looks fine. So we have city key, dimension. So by the time you've done this, you can test out just to be sure that you're selecting the columns and everything is working fine. So if you're running this for the first time, you may be prompted to provide your login details. You just get a white space. For example, credentials are required to connect to SQL source. So you need to provide your credentials. That's not too hard. If you scroll down, let me see if I can. I know I was able to detach this yesterday. Yeah. So if you find this, what you can just do is to select your data source, the credential type, just select Windows. I have the database here on my system, so I don't need to provide any key, password, and stuff. So what you can do next is to just test connection and ensure credential has been set. Is the connection successful? If the connection is successful, it means that I can run this one more time to see how it works out. So I just minimize this and just bring it down here. Yeah, down here is fine. Up next, I can just go back and run this one more time. So when I run this one more time, it says error. Let me see. Error, what's the error message? Okay, let me see. This is frozen. Okay, this is fine. This is fine. It was running in the background. Now you see that we have the city key, city, state, province, and sales territory. You see that, right? So this is working fine. There was no need for us to go into the query editor and start testing out our functions and coming back here to see if our code is working fine or not. You can test out everything here directly. That's the first step. So the next step now is to start applying the condition that we have in the question. The condition says that the city name must contain A, D, and C, right? And it's also case sensitive, so we must write it the way we see it right here. So when I saw this question for the first time, my thought was like, oh wow, this is super simple. I can just write something simple and solve it. So here's what I did. I did select rows. So if you also note, what I also noticed is that when you write the names of columns, like for example, let me show you. Select, let's just do it, you'll see it. Select rows equal to, so we have table. So the way I would do it in the past is like the way we did yesterday, I was also table, select rows, and the suggestions, the IntelliSense will still bring up suggestions. I saw that that was the issue here. So you can't really do that here. You have to do table dot, the way you work with it, table select dot select. Then you have your select rows. Up next, there are some stuff that are working fine in Visual Studio Code. For example, the indentation works really fine, but here I have to ident it manually. So you have to provide the previous table dimension setting, which works fine. Up next, we want to check select where contains A, D, and C. Remember, so we look over the column, we check a value in the column. So we use text dot contains. Remember, we are using the city column. We're checking the city column to see if it contains A. Now we have to check if it contains D. My idea was that if I do this and repeat the same process, paste this, and this should be D, and this should be C. So we have our condition here. So we run this and it returns what we want to see, returns the result we want to see. Now I had issue when I wanted to reference this step. Now in the Visual Studio, what should I call it? Visual Studio Code, it works fine, but here it doesn't work. So that means I have to start taking out the spaces and not use them at all. That was the only way I could start referencing previous row. If you use what you use just now, you will run into issues. Or we can change this into selected rows. Selected rows. Yep, this works fine. So we can run this and see the result. Now, one of the issues you will notice is that you will think you've gotten token breakback expected. What's happening? Where? Let me see. Okay, our result is ready. I'm still trying to get used to this. So we have the results that we were expecting, but this is not working the way it should work, right? This is not correct. What I'm seeing here is not correct at all. The results are wrong. And you're wondering, okay, why is it returning a wrong result? What you can do is to, let me say this. Oh, this right here, I think this is where this should explain what this error was saying earlier. So we can close this brackets. Yeah, CCT. This right here is also CT. This is CT. That should explain the error I saw earlier. I'm going to run this one more time. Okay, no more error. Okay, it's still running. Yeah, so we have the results right here. So we see where we have like D. So you see that it's not checking for the full list of the alphabets that we've passed. Rather, it's just checking if any of the alphabets exists, D exists, C exists, it will just return that particular value. And that is not what we want. And if you want to confirm, for now, I'm not sure if you can see the query has been generated right here. But I believe you can just come back to the query editor here, go to advanced, paste, and click on done. So this will just run some simple query and you can now view the native query. When you view the native query, you realize that this is not going to work. This is not going to give us the result that we need. So if you want the result that we need, that means we have to do something different, right? We have to approach this problem differently. Now, the next step we need to take, as I mentioned, is to remove this previous step. We don't need it anymore because it is not solving the problem that we want. So we can take out the comma and make sure what we just have here is dimension city. Okay, this looks fine. So what we can do now is to think of how to select. We have to create a list of all cities, right? To create a list of all cities, what we have to do is just say city. Let me see. I think I made a mistake here. Double bracket, correct. Comma. Then city list is equal to. Now we'll be referencing dimension city, and we want the city column. Selected the city column. Now we have a list of all the city names, but we want to make sure that there are no duplicates. So we use a list dot distinct. This ensures that all the values we are going to be getting in the city list are unique values. So that's fine. So we need to take another step. So for each city, the name of each city is a text. We want to convert that text to a list. So if the name of the city is London, we want to convert it from the text London to a list containing all the alphabets in that name. So let's do that. So we do city to list. So what we are going to be here, we're transforming a list. So we do, what do we do here? Do transform city. What am I doing? List dot transform. What are we transforming? We are transforming city list. And how are we transforming the values in this list? We want to transform each value such that we use the text, I think text to list. Yes. So each text becomes a list. Then finally, we close the bracket. Now you may be curious on what the result of this looks like. So let's see. You will not be able to read the values since the values are going to be a list. You can't really view the values here. So if we should run this, let's test this out and see what it looks like. Okay, finally our result is ready. Seems like I need a better laptop. So our result is ready, and realize that the result for each row is a list. So you can't really view this. So I believe these are some of the limitations you will experience as you're using Visual Studio. What you can also do is to, instead of test this particular step here out, you can test it out here in Power Query. Go to Power Query, Advanced Editor, and just paste this here. And now you have your list. Then you can now expand this just to see what it looks like. You see Boston, we have Boston height. There are other options like, let me see. This is Ashport. So you see that the name of each city is now a list. So you have an idea. So we can iterate over that list now to see if what we are looking for is present in that particular list. So let's go back to Visual Studio. Now that we are confident that this is working fine, we need to now start checking each list to see if it contains the alphabet capital A, small letter D, and capital C. So we add a new step, and we can just call this selected cities, selected cities is equal to lists. List, now what we want to do is to select a city. List dot select. We're selecting from the city to list. Each we want to confirm, and that list contains what we are looking for. So we'll do list dot contains. Now there are multiple options here. There's contains all, and contains, and you want to use contains all. So each of the city name must contain all the values that we are passing. So we use contains all. Now we need to check the list to ensure that it contains the values that we are going to be passing. What are the values that we are passing? We're going to be passing A. After A, we have D, and finally capital C. Now, if the city name contains all these values, we'll be able to select that city name. But remember that the city name is still a list, right? So after selecting the city name, we need to convert that list back to a text such that we can use it and display it in a way that is more readable. So we can say final list, for example, final list, or yeah, let me just say final list is equal to. So for this step, we can now transform the list one more time. So we use the list dot transform. What are we transforming? We're transforming selected. Let me see. I'm not getting any suggestions. Oh, this should be a comma. Transform selected cities. How do we want to transform the selected city? There's an option to combine all the text in the list into a text. So we use text dot combine. Now we pass the list and we combine this. So we now have the values that we want to see. So we can just import this to see what it looks like. Final list. So click on run. If you click on start, your code is going to run. Let's wait for the result. We cannot convert the value boosting height to type list. Where did that happen? Let's see. Where did that happen? So we have run into an issue, and I don't know the step where this has happened, right? So I'm suspecting it should be here. Okay, so I'll go back to, because this is supposed to work fine. We should be able to convert this to list. So let's test it out in Power Query and see where the issue is coming from. So taking out the step, we've not done anything magical yet. Basically added a few steps. Great. So let's click on done. So let's take it one step at a time and see where the error has happened. So list. Okay, this is where the error has happened. So here is the issue. List the select each, because we know that city is a list, right? Then we are iterating over the list. Let me see. Did I miss anything for each list here? Oh, convert this into a list. So this step is fine. We don't have any issue with this step. So we want to select this where the issue is. The issue is in city each list contains. Oh, I selected, yeah, contains all should work. Fine. So let me see where the error is. You're about to create, yeah, no problem. Let me see what the error is. You cannot convert the value button height to type list. That is weird since, let me see. That is weird since city to list. Oh, we are referring to city list. That is where the problem is. Oh, I see that now. We can head back here and resolve that problem. So what we did here is that we did city to list. So for the selected cities, we have to reference the city to list where we have already converted the cities to list. So we're referencing the previous step and that wouldn't have worked in any way. I didn't see that before. Then this contains all final list. So I'm going to be running this one more time to see if it works out. Great. So this works fine. Now, these are the names of the cities that contain the letter capital C, small letter D, and capital A. So these are the names of all those cities. So we've been able to crack this problem. But that is not all. We need a means to pass these letters here, the name of all these cities to Power Query, right? So to do that, all we have to do is we have to use the contain function for list, but I'll show you how that works out. So we do, what do we call this? We can call this selected rows A, D, C equal to this. For this step, what we have to do is use a table function, table.select rows, select rows, and we have to provide the tables where we use the table last, right? We have to reference the table from a previous step. So we'll be referencing the table from the dimension city. And now for each, we want to do this where each, then we use the list dot contains. Now list has multiple options. Remember here we use the list dot contains all, right? Where we check a list and see if it contains all the values. But if we use contains all here, we're going to be running into an issue. Here we want comparing it against a value. We're not passing a list to it. So we're going to be passing the name of a city to this small list to see if the name of the city exists. So we're going to be using contains because contains says list as list and value. So we have our list of values, then we bring a value and say check if this value exists. So to do that, we use a contains. There's option for contains all, but we don't want contains any, just contains. Since we are passing a single value, the list is going to be final list. Then we say comma. And remember the value we are going to be passing now is what? City. We're going to be passing city as a value and close this bracket if this is fine. And finally, we can say selected cities ABC, save. So this is our final result. We can run this to see what our final result is going to look like. And now we have the names of all the cities that contains the capital letter A, small letter D, and capital letter C. So we've been able to answer the question. So we can check this out in Power Query to see if query folding is still working out. So I don't know. I'll keep checking. If I find any results that shows us how to confirm if query folding is still enabled, I'll show you how that works. But if I can't find anything, we may have to still stick to using the query editor to confirm if query folding is still working or not. So copying the step and I'll go back to the query editor and paste this. Click on done. Mind you, if you are unable to install Visual Studio on your system, you don't really need to do it in Visual Studio. All you have to do is to apply the same steps we are applying in Visual Studio. Just keep adding one step after the other. If you want to reduce the number of lines, you can nest these functions inside each other and see what the result looks like. So now we have our result. We have city key, we have the city, they all have capital A's and C's and lowercase d, and that solves the problem for us, right? So I ran into issues. I have to go online, check what Alex, for example, has done. Like, oh yeah, so this is how this works. And I'm like, oh, I missed the step. I need to got ideas from there. Then you, because without him, I wouldn't be able to solve it because this was giving me a lot of problem. We can now confirm that query folding is working fine. Let's see, it's taking time to load now. Now you start, we have the list of cities that have been passed to this, where we have city in, and this is really good. When I started out this challenge, I've been wondering about how to do city in, how does it work, how can I implement it? But now you see how to implement your city in. When I did mine initially, I did cities, I used list that contains all. When I did list that contains all, everything was messed up. The query was running forever. So with this, we've been able to solve the problem for today's challenge. And it's been really amazing, really. It's been amazing. And the experience has been good. And the fact that we can now do this in Visual Studio is really great. Very great.
Thank you for watching this video. If you want to watch more videos like this one, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to like the video before you leave.